Welcome back to the dark. The rain has not stopped. In fact, I believe it is growing heavier. In our previous sessions, we mapped the high theological architecture of Middle-earth. We observed the angelic nature of the shadow. We analyzed the elven philosophy of hope, and we watched the ultimate, crushing failure of the human will at the edge of the abyss. We treated the mythology of Arda as a closed, self-sustaining universe of philosophical truth. But myths are not born in a vacuum. They are not simply spun out of thin air by men sitting in comfortable, quiet rooms. The greatest myths are forged in the furnaces of profound collective trauma. When we read The Lord of the Rings, we are not merely looking at the tapestry of invented languages and fairy tales. We are looking at a deeply encoded, heavily scarred psychological diary. We are looking at the bleeding, physical fingerprints of the First World War. To truly understand the darkness of Mordor, we must first understand what was lost. We must travel back to a time and a place that existed long before the sky turned to ash. We must look at the Shire. In the modern pop culture consciousness, the Shire is often dismissed as the most boring, simplistic part of Tolkien's mythology. It is a fairy tale land of green hills, fat, cheerful little people, overflowing pantries and endless parties. It feels completely disconnected from the grand, epic sweep of the rest of the narrative. But this is a fatal misreading of the text. Tolkien did not invent the Shire. He entombed it. The Shire is an exact photographic reconstruction of rural England at the turn of the 20th century. Specifically, it is a mirror of the Warwickshire countryside, a small, idyllic hamlet called Sarehall, where an orphaned young Ronald Tolkien spent the happiest, most stable years of his life. Historically, we call this the Edwardian era. It was a brief, shining window of time between the death of Queen Victoria and the outbreak of the Great War. For the rural middle class of England, it was time of unprecedented peace. The British Empire was absolute. The economy was stable. The harvest was good. Historians often refer to years immediately preceding 1914 as the Long Summer. It was an era characterized by a profound, almost naive optimism. People genuinely believed that humanity had outgrown the savage, mass-scale wars of the past. They believed the future would simply be a quiet, uninterrupted continuation of the present. Look at the hobbits. They are the perfected, undiluted avatars of the Edwardian innocence. They are deeply agrarian. They do not care about the grand politics of men or the ancient magic of elves. They are obsessed with entirely mundane, earthly things: brewing beer, cultivating pipeweed, charting their family genealogies, and ensuring that they eat 6 square meals a day. They are deeply suspicious of anything foreign, and they view anyone who lives outside their immediate borders as strange and untrustworthy. The hobbits are not stupid. They are simply insulated. They are a generation of youth living in the deep, green heart of a global empire, completely unaware of the industrial machinery that is slowly turning in the darkness beyond the borders. Tolkien writes of the Shire. They were sheltered, but they had ceased to remember it. The single line is a psychological key to an entire generation of young men. When the boys of Oxfordshire, Warwickshire, and Lancastershire went to sleep in the early summer of 1914, they went to sleep in the Shire. They were safe. The world was green, the rivers were clear, and the greatest threat to their existence was a bad harvest or a stern reprimand from a local landowner. They had absolutely no concept of the mechanized, absolute terror that was quietly assembling itself across the English Channel. And then the clock struck August. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo acted as a spark in a global powder keg. The intricate, fragile web of European alliances suddenly collapsed, putting the entire continent into the abyss. The long summer died overnight. Suddenly, the young men of rural England, the real-world hobbits who had never held a weapon more dangerous than a farming scythe, were pulled from their green fields, handed Lee Enfield rifles, and told to march toward the continent. Tolkien, a brilliant, sensitive student of philology at Oxford, was caught in this massive historical undertow. He watched as his closest friends, his brothers in arms, were systematically drafted into the meat grinder. He watched the idyllic countryside of his youth empty out, as the boys of the Shire boarded trains heading east toward the coast. They were told it would be a grand adventure. They were told it would be over by Christmas. They didn't know that they were walking straight out of the Edwardian summer and directly into the mechanized jaws of Mordor. The transition was not a gradual darkening. It was a brutal, physical shock to the human system. The world shifted from green grass and acoustic peace to a landscape of rusted iron, suffocating smoke, and endless, rhythmic pounding of heavy artillery. As we leave the Shire behind, we must now examine how this sudden, terrifying industrialization of Europe permanently altered Tolkien's definition of evil. We're about to see how the smoke of the factories and the fires of the munitions plants birthed the dark citadels of Isengard and Barad-dûr. We are about to map the mechanization of Malice. Before the summer of 1914, the concept of war in the European consciousness was heavily romanticized. It was viewed through the archaic lens of the 19th century. War was a matter of cavalry charges, brightly colored uniforms, noble duels, and swift, decisive victories. It was a terrible endeavor, yes, but it was still considered a deeply human one. But the Great War completely destroyed that paradigm. When the conflict settled into the muddy trenches of Western Front, the generals and the politicians realized that human valor was no longer the deciding factor. A single machine gun nest could annihilate 1,000 charging men in a matter of seconds. Artillery shells could obliterate entire battalions before they even saw the enemy. War was no longer a contest of human will. It had become a factory. It had become an industry of mass slaughter, governed by mathematics, logistics, and the relentless mechanical production of death. If we look at the mythology of Arda, we can see exactly how this dramatic shift in the nature of warfare permanently altered Tolkien's definition of evil. In the ancient mythologies that Tolkien studied, and even in his own early writings of the First Age, evil is often depicted as something singular and monstrous. It is a terrible dragon hoarding gold, It is a dark spirit hiding in the deep woods. It is a localized physical threat. But by the time we reach the Third Age and the War of the Ring, the architecture of evil has fundamentally changed. The shadow is no longer just a monster. It is an industrial complex. There is no greater symbol of this transition than the fall of Saruman and the corruption of Isengard. Saruman the White was originally sent to Middle-earth to be a guardian of wisdom. His fortress, Orthanc, was surrounded by a beautiful green valley filled with ancient trees and clear streams. But when Saruman's ambition becomes corrupted by the prospect of absolute power, he does not simply learn darker magic. He begins a process of absolute, ruthless industrialization. Tolkien gives the ultimate diagnosis of this new, modern evil through the ancient eyes of Treebird. The Ent says of Saruman, "He has a mind of metal and wheels, and he does not care for growing things, except as far as they serve him for the moment." A mind of metal and wheels. This is the exact psychological profile of military-industrial complex that devoured Europe. Saruman ordered his orcs to tear down the ancient forest of Fangorn. They do not chop down the trees to build houses. They fell the great oaks of the ancient ash to feed the subterranean furnaces of Isengard. They dam the river, they poison the water, and they tear open the earth to mass-produce weapons, armor, and explosives. Tolkien watched the exact same process happen to the green countryside of France and Belgium. He watched forests that had stood for centuries be reduced to splintered, blackened matchsticks by endless artillery barrages. He watched the earth be torn open, flooded with mud, and poisoned by mustard gas, all to serve the temporary, strategic ambitions of men sitting in distant command tents. But the mechanization of malice goes far beyond the destruction of landscape. It extends to the ultimate degradation of the living soul. We must closely examine the foot soldiers of this industrial war. The orcs. It is very easy to dismiss the orcs as a generic fantasy monsters. But if you read the chapters where Frodo, Sam, Merry and Pippin are captured and dragged across the plains, you get a deeply disturbing, intimate look at the internal culture of Sauron's army. The orc do not speak like mythical demons. They speak like brutalized, exhausted, and deeply cynical French soldiers. Listen to the conversations between the orc captains Ugluk, Krishnak, Shagrat, and Gorbak. They constantly complain about their rations. They complain about the confusing, contradictory orders coming down from the high brass in the Dark Tower. They resent the Nazgûl, whom they view as terrifying elite officers who fly above the mud, while the regular infantry does the dying. They are entirely stripped of their individuality, marked only by the serial numbers and insignias branded on their shields. In the horrifying calculus of Mordor and Isengard, an orc has absolutely no intrinsic value. They are not warriors, they are resource. They are bred in dark, subterranean pits specifically to hold a spear, march in a straight line, and absorb the arrows of the enemy. They are the ultimate manifestation of cannon fodder. Tolkien, serving as a signaling officer in the trenches of the Somme, was surrounded by this reality. He saw thousands of young men stripped of their names and their civilian identities, dressed in identical khaki uniforms, fed into the meat grinder of the Western Front. He saw the bureaucracy of death, where human lives were traded for a few yards of ruined mud. Sauron does not govern through dark magic alone. He governs through administration. Mordor is a vast logistical machine. The ash-choked plateau of Gorgoroth is its factory floor, and the great slave-worked farms around the Sea of Nurnan are its supply lines. The Shadow's ultimate triumph is not simply that it kills people. It is that it reduces the miracle of life into a mathematical statistic. It reduces the majesty of a forest into fuel for a furnace, and it reduces a living, breathing creature into a cog in a machine of wheel and metal. But a machine of this magnitude produces a terrible byproduct. When millions of bodies are fed into the gears of an industrialized war, they do not simply vanish, they accumulate. The earth cannot swallow them fast enough. As we leave the smoking ruins of Isengard and travel farther east toward the very borders of Mordor, the geography begins to thicken. The water becomes stagnant, the ground turns to rot. We must now follow the cartographer into the most haunting and direct historical translation in all of Tolkien's work. We must step off the solid ground and wade into the stagnant, corpse-choked waters of the Dead Marshes. When an industrialized war machine begins to operate at maximum capacity, it consumes human life faster than the earth can absorb it. The factories of Isengard and the vast logistical networks of Mordor are efficient. But Battlefield itself is a place of absolute, stagnant decay. As Frodo Baggins, Samwise Gamgee, and their wretched guide, Gollum, slowly make their way toward the impenetrable mountains of Mordor, they must cross a vast, treacherous landscape that acts as a physical barrier to the Dark Lord's realm. They must cross the Dead Marshes. Tolkien's description of this geography is arguably the most horrific, bestial, and deeply suffocating passage in the entire mythology of Middle-earth. The environment is entirely hostile to life. The ground is a treacherous web of soft mud, hidden sinkholes and rotting vegetation. The air is choked with a thick, poisonous fog, and the only light comes from the sickened, green, glowing vapors that hover over the stagnant pools of black water. Gollum warns the hobbit not to follow the lights. He calls them the candles of the corpses. According to the internal history of Arda, the Dead Marshes were once the site of a massive, ancient conflict, the Battle of Dagorlad, fought thousands of years prior to the end of the Second Age. Over the centuries, the swamps slowly expanded, swallowing the graves of the fallen, turning the ancient battlefield into a flooded, rotting cemetery. As the hobbits crawled through the darkness, starved, exhausted, and terrified of the ring wraiths flying in the clouds above, Frodo suddenly stops. He looks down into one of the dark, shallow pools of water, and the water looks back. Tolkien writes, "They lie in all the pools, pale faces, deep, deep under the dark water. I saw them, grim faces and evil, and noble faces and sad, many faces, proud and fair, and weeds in their silver hair, but a foul, but all fall, all rotting, all dead." Gollum, completely desensitized to the horror, confirms the terrible reality. He tells them that they are elves and men and orcs lying in the mud together. The great equalizer of the swamp has stripped away their allegiances, their banners, and their mythic grandeur. In death, there are no heroes and no villains. There is only rotting meat, preserved in the cold, stagnant water, staring blindly up at the sky. When you read this passage as a work of pure fantasy, it is a brilliant piece of Gothic horror. But when you read it with the understanding of Tolkien's physical history, the fantasy instantly dissolves. The elves and the orc vanish, and you are left staring directly into the muddy, blood-soaked craters of the First World War. In a letter written in 1960, Tolkien explicitly admitted to the origin of this nightmare. He wrote, "The Dead Marshes and the approaches to the more unknown owe something to the northern France after the Battle of Somme. It is a profound understatement, the defining ultimate horror of the Western Front, specifically during the Somme offensive in 1916 and later at Passchendaele in 1917, was not just the machine guns or the poison gas. It was the mud. Millions of heavy artillery shells had completely obliterated the neutral drainage system of the French and Belgian countryside. The heavy, continuous rains turned the churned earth into a vast, bottomless ocean of thick, freezing and incredibly adhesive clay. When a soldier was killed in no man's land, it was often impossible to retrieve the body. To step out of the trench was suicide. And so, the bodies simply lay where they fell. As the artillery bombardments continue, the heavy explosive shells would create massive, deep craters in the earth. These craters would immediately fill with rainwater and groundwater, and the bodies of the fallen, British, French, and German alike, would slide down the muddy banks into the water. Tolkien, as a young officer in the Lancashire Fusiliers, lived in this mud for months. To navigate the trench networks and to cross no man's lands, soldiers had to walk across narrow, slippery wooden duckboards laid over the flooded craters. If a soldier slipped and fell into the mud with his heavy pack and rifle, he would often drown. His comrades, already under fire and unable to find leverage in the slime, would be completely powerless to pull him out. And as Tolkien and his men crawled through the darkness, desperate to avoid the sweeping lights of the German flares and the eyes of the snipers, they would look down into the flooded shell holes beside the path. They saw exactly what Frodo Baggins saw. They saw the pale, bloated, and rotting faces of the men who had died in the weeks and months prior, floating just beneath the surface of the stagnant water. They saw the faces of their friends, and they saw the faces of their enemies, lying together in the dark. The Dead Marshes are not a fairy tale. They are exact, traumatic memory preserved in the amber of mythology. Tolkien took the ultimate, unspeakable psychological horror of seeing a generation of young men rotting unburied in the water, and he forced the reader to walk through it. He makes us feel the treacherous footing. He makes us smell the rotting vapors. He forces us to look down at the faces of the dead. For the hobbits, the psychological toll of the Dead Marshes is immense. Frodo is mesmerized by the lights. He's pulled toward the water, almost falling into a trance, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of the dead. It is a perfect representation of the survivor's guilt and the paralyzing trauma that gripped the veterans of the trenches. The dead are constantly calling to the living, threatening to pull them down into the mud with them. But the marshes are merely the borderlands. If the hero survives the water, he must eventually step onto the solid, ruined earth of the Dark Lord's inner domain. As we pull ourselves out of the mud and follow the hobbits to the Black Gate, we must now observe the physical architecture of industrialized wasteland. We must cross the no man's land. If a soldier manages to survive the stagnant, coarse-choked waters of the flooded craters, he must eventually pull himself out of the mud. He must drag his exhausted body onto the solid, ruined earth. For Frodo and Sam, this moment occurs when they finally bypass the Black Gate, navigate the treacherous stairs of Cirith Ungol, and step onto the sprawling, ash-covered plateau of Gorgoroth. They have entered the inner domain of Mordor. In conventional fantasy literature, the villain's realm is often depicted as a place of dark, gothic majesty, towering obsidian castles, rivers of glowing lava, and dramatic thunderstorms. But Tolkien's description of Mordor is remarkably devoid of romantic majesty. When the hobbits look out across Gorgoroth, they do not see a grand, demonic empire. They see a vast, monotonous, and utterly pulverized wasteland. Tolkien writes, "Here nothing lived, not even the leprous growths that fed on rottenness. The gasping pools were choked with ash and crawling muds, sickly white and grey, as if the mountains had vomited the filth of their entrails upon the lands about." This is not a landscape of magic. This is the clinical, topographical architecture of no man's land. During the First World War, no man's land was the term given to the disputed territory between the opposing trench networks, because this ground was the focal point of continuous, multi-year artillery bombardments from both sides. It was subjected to a level of physical destruction that had never been seen before in the history of the Earth. The bombardments pulverized the topsoil, shattered the bedrock, and obliterated every single tree, bush, and blade of grass. What remained was a chaotic, unrecognizable lunar landscape of overlapping craters, jagged rocks, and mountains of pulverized chalk and ash. When Frodo and Sam attempt to cross Gorgoroth, they are forced to navigate this exact same topography. They cannot walk in a straight line. They are forced to crawl on their bellies, sliding down into deep, ash-filled pits, and desperately scrambling up the steep, jagged sides of ruined stone. Every inch of movement is an agonizing, physical struggle against a broken world. But the physical ruin of the earth was only one aspect of no man's land. The greater horror was the obstacles left behind the enemy. The Western Front was defined by hundreds of thousands of miles of barbed wire. It was thick, rusted, and deliberately tangled into massive, impenetrable thickets designed to trap charging infantry and hold them in place for the machine guns. Look closely at how Tolkien translates this industrial weapon into the natural environment of Mordor. As the hobbits crawl across the plateau, their clothes are torn and their flesh is shredded by what Tolkien calls the brambles of Mordor, that twisted, thorny bush that behaves exactly like rusted wire, wrapping around their ankles and refusing to let go. They bled for every single yard they advance. There is no clean water. The streams in Mordor are poisoned, bitter, and choked with chemical runoff from the forges, mirroring the gas-tainted toxic puddles of the battlefield. The hobbits are dying of thirst, surrounded by an environment that actively wants to kill them. But all of the terrors in no man's land, the greatest and most paralyzing threat was the feeling of absolute exposure. In the trenches, a soldier's primary psychological burden was the constant, suffocating paranoia that he was being watched. To raise your head above the parapet during daylight was a guaranteed death sentence from an enemy sniper. At night, the darkness provided no true cover, because the opposing forces would constantly fire brilliant magnesium star shells and sweep the ruined earth with massive industrial searchlights. If the soldier was caught in the blinding glare of a flare while crawling through the wire, his only hope for survival was to freeze completely, pressing his face into the mud, praying he looked like a corpse. This brings us to the most iconic, terrifying entity in Tolkien's entire mythology, the Eye of Sauron. In cinematic adaptations, the eye is often depicted as a literal, glowing lighthouse made of fire. But in the psychology of the books and in the context of the Great War, the eye is something much more insidious. It is the ultimate manifestation of the sniper's scope and the searchlight's glare. Tolkien describes the eye not just as a physical object, but as a sweeping, piercing beam of oppressive will. As Frodo and Sam crawl across the ash, they are constantly pinned down by the terrifying sensation of being scanned. The eye was not turned to them, Tolkien writes, but its harsh, sweeping beam was present. They were aware of it, a piercing light, and they lay like dead things, fearful that any movement would bring it down upon them. The hobbits behave exactly like infantrymen caught in no man's land. When the gaze of the Dark Tower sweeps over their sector, they do not fight. They freeze. They press their bodies flat against the jagged rocks, trying to become invisible, paralyzed by the absolute certainty that if the beam stops on them, the artillery of Mordor will immediately follow. Frodo and Sam are not walking through Mordor like traditional fantasy heroes. They are dressed in scavenged, ill-fitting orc armor, shuffling through the dust, their lips cracked, their bodies starved, their minds completely fractured by paranoia and exhaustion. They are two infantrymen behind enemy lines, trapped in an industrial slaughterhouse, performing a slow, agonizing crawl toward an impossible objective. They are operating far beyond the maximum breaking strain of the human body. So, how do they keep moving? If the environment is fundamentally unsurvivable and the psychological terror of the eye is absolute, what prevents them from simply laying their heads down in the ash and dying? To answer this, we must look at the specific, intimate bond between the two hobbits. We must understand how the British Army functioned in the trenches, and we must decode the profound historical relationship between the exhausted officer and his faithful bateman. When we observe the sprawling, mechanized hellscape of no man's land, a fundamental question arises. How do mortal creatures survive it? When the human body is deprived of food, poisoned by toxic water, and subjected to the paralyzing, continuous terror of an enemy's gaze, the mind eventually breaks. The survival of Frodo Baggins across the ash of Mordor defies all biological and psychological logic. To understand how he reaches the mountain, we must completely demystify the relationship between Frodo and his companion, Samwise Gamgee. In the realm of modern fantasy critique, their dynamic is often misunderstood. It is frequently read simply as a touching story of best friends, or conversely, criticized as an archaic, class-based tale of a wealthy master and his subservient gardener. Both of these interpretations completely miss the profound historical architecture of their bond. Frodo and Sam are not simply friends on a quest. They are a precise, historical reconstruction of a very specific military dynamic from the First World War: the officer and his bateman. In the British Army of 1914, the class system dictated the structure of the military. Young, highly educated men from the upper and the middle classes, men from Oxford and Cambridge, were almost automatically commissioned as junior officers. They were the lieutenants and captains tasked with leading the platoons over the top. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was one of these men. He was a young officer in the Lancashire Fusiliers. But the British Army knew that these young gentlemen, despite their education, were entirely unequipped for the brutal, physical reality of survival in the mud. And so, every officer was designed a bateman. A bateman was an enlisted soldier, usually drawn from the working class, farmers, miners, and laborers. The bateman acted as an orderly, as bodyguard, and a caretaker for the officer. His job was not to plan the strategy or lead the charge. His job was to keep the officer alive. The bateman made the tea, cleaned the mud from the rifles, managed the meager rations, and ensured the officer got a few hours of sleep. Tolkien developed an overwhelming, lifelong admiration for these men. He watched young officers, crushed by the psychological burden of command, completely break down in the trenches, only to be physically and emotionally carried through the nightmare by their bateman. In a letter written in 1956, Tolkien stated this explicitly: "My Sam Genji is indeed a reflection of the English soldier, of the privates and batemen I knew in the 1914 war, and recognize as so far superior to myself." If we map this military structure onto the hobbits, the entire dynamic of the final chapters clicks into perfect, devastating focus. Frodo is the young officer. He's carrying the ultimate burden of command, the One Ring. The ring represents the strategic objective, but it also represents the crushing, psychological trauma of the war itself. It is a slow-acting poison, much like shell shock. As they progress deeper into Mordor, Frodo becomes increasingly isolated. He stops eating, he loses his sight, he forgets the memory of his home. He is entirely consumed by the mission, and the trauma is systematically dismantling his mind. Samwise Gamgee is the bateman. Notice what Sam actually does through the journey. He does not carry the ring. He does not bear the psychological weight of saving the world. Instead, he focuses entirely on the mechanics of physical survival. He carries the heavy packs. He rations the last drops of water in their canteens. He stands watch while Frodo sleeps. When Frodo is paralyzed by the eye, it is Sam who physically pulls him into the shadows. And most importantly, Sam acts as the anchor to sanity. When the darkness is absolute, Sam talks about the Shire. He talks about green grass and gardens and home, what the British soldiers in the trenches desperately referred to as Blighty. Sam is the physical tether keeping the officer from floating away into total madness. This dynamic reaches its absolute heartbreaking climax on the jagged, ash-covered slopes of Mount Doom. Frodo's mind has finally broken. The trauma of the ring has paralyzed his body. He collapses on the stone, entirely spent, unable to move another inch. The officer has failed. The war has demanded more than his physiology can provide. Samwise looks down at his friend. He looks up at the roaring fire of the mountain above them. He calculates the impossible distance, and he realizes the ultimate, unspoken duty of the military bateman. He cannot carry the burden of command. He cannot take the ring because the ring belongs to the officer's jurisdiction. But he can carry the man. "Come, Mr. Frodo," Sam cries. "I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you." And he lifts him. Sam hoists the broken, starving body of his commander onto his own shoulders, and he begins the impossible, agonizing crawl up to the side of the volcano. This is not a scene of magical heroism. It is the grim, desperate reality of a working-class soldier dragging his wounded lieutenant through the mud of no man's land, refusing to let him die in the dark. It is an act of pure, unadulterated love forged in the absolute worst conditions that human beings can inflict upon one another. Sam gets the officer to the door. He fulfills his duty, but as we know from the geometry of the trenches, surviving the mission does not mean you survive the war. As we approach the end of our journey, we must now examine what happens when the objective is destroyed. The guns fall silent and the soldiers are finally sent home. We must look at the invisible wounds. We must look at the ghost in the machine. In the traditional architecture of fairy tale, the deconstruction of the evil artifact is the final mechanism of the plot. When the dragon is slain, or when the ring is cast into the fire, the dark clouds instantly part. The heroes return home to a world bathed in sunlight. They are given their rightful rewards, and they live happily to the end of their days. But Tolkien did not write a fairy tale. He wrote a mythology grounded in the bloody dirt of 20th century, and he knew with a terrible, intimate certainty that simple surviving a war does not mean you escape it. When the guns of the First World War finally fell silent in November of 1918, the British Empire celebrated. The Great Shadow had been defeated. But for the millions of young men who returned from the trenches of France and Belgium, the armistice was not a magical cure. They returned to their green valleys, to their quiet towns, and to their families. The machine out of their bodies had survived, but the spirit inside the machine was broken. During the war, the British medical establishment encountered a terrifying new psychological phenomenon. Soldiers who had not sustained a single physical scratch were completely paralyzed. They suffered from night terrors, uncontrollable tremors, blindness, and profound, suffocating dislocation from reality. The doctors, lacking the vocabulary of modern psychiatry, called it shell shock. They believed it was a physical concussion of the brain caused by the proximity to exploding artillery. They did not understand that it was in fact a catastrophic moral and spiritual injury. It was what we now call the post-traumatic stress disorder. Tolkien did not just witness shell shock in his fellow soldiers, he lived it. After surviving the unimaginable slaughter of the Somme, Tolkien contracted a severe case of trench fever and was sent back to hospital in England. As he lay in his bed, recovering from the physical ailment, the telegrams began to arrive, one by one. Almost every single one of his closest childhood friends, the boys he had grown up with in the Edwardian summer was killed in the mud. He survived, but he was left behind to carry the invisible, crushing weight of their memories. Now, look at the fate of Frodo Baggins. When Frodo returns to the Shire, he is hailed as a hero. The world has been saved. The sun is shining. Samwise Gamgee quickly integrates back into society. He marries the girl he loves. He rebuilds his home and he begins to plant new trees. Sam is the ideal image of a veteran who manages to find healing through the simple agrarian rhythms of life. But Frodo does not heal. Tolkien writes Frodo's post-war existence with an accuracy that is clinically devastating. Frodo drops out of public life. He becomes quiet. He walks through the familiar green hills of his youth, but he is completely alienated from the people he sacrificed everything to protect. The other hobbits look at him with confusion. They cannot understand why he is not participating in their celebrations. They cannot see the invisible landscape he is still navigating. Frodo is physically walking through the Shire, but mentally is permanently trapped on the ash-covered plateau of Golgoroth. He's a ghost, haunting his own life. And then there are the anniversaries. In modern psychology, we know that trauma is often cyclical. The body remembers the calendar. Every year, on the exact dates of his most profound traumas, Frodo falls violently ill. On October 6th, the anniversary of being stabbed by the Nazgul at Weathertop, Frodo is gripped by an agonizing, freezing pain in his shoulder. He takes to his bed, shivering in the dark. On March 13th, the anniversary of being poisoned by the giant spider Shelob, a dark, suffocating despair completely consumes his mind. He tells Samwise it is gone forever, and now all is dark and empty. When Gandalf asks him how he's faring, Frodo delivers the ultimate tragic diagnosis of the veteran. "I'm wounded," he says. "It will never really heal." Frodo does not carry a sword anymore. He has become an absolute pacifist. When the Shire is briefly attacked by remnants of Saruman's thugs, Frodo refuses to strike a little blow. He has seen too much death. The capacity for violence has been completely burned out of him. He sits in his study, surrounded by his books, holding a white gem that was given to him by the elven queen Arwen. He is trying to write his memoir, trying to make sense of the nightmare, but his strength is fading. Tolkien captures the ultimate tragedy of the ring-bearer. The irony is absolute, and it is devastating. Frodo achieved the impossible. He carried the bomb to the center of the enemy's fortress. He absorbed the absolute radiation of the dark. But the cost of saving the Shire was his own capacity to live in it. "I tried to save the Shire," he tells Sam, "and it has been saved, but not for me." Frodo Baggins actually died inside Mount Doom. The machine of his body simply took a few years to finally catch up. But the trauma of the war did not merely poison the mind of the hero. It poisoned the world itself. The industrialization of evil that began in Isengard could not be contained to the borders of Mordor. The war had changed the fundamental nature of Arda. As we open our final chapter, we must confront the ultimate bitter truth of the veteran's return. We must look at the chapter that the cinematic adaptation chose to erase. We must watch as the boys of the Shire return to the idyllic home they dreamed of in the trenches, only to find that the machine of the new century has already arrived to tear it down. We must look at the scoring of the Shire. In the trenches of the Western Front, there was a single, fragile thought that kept the British soldiers from surrendering entirely to the madness. It was the dream of home. They held on to the belief that if they could just survive the gas, the mud, and the artillery, they could eventually board a train back to the quiet, green shires of England. They believed that home was a sanctuary, frozen in amber, completely untouched by the horrors of the continent. But time does not freeze, and the machinery of the 20th century was hungry. When Peter Jackson adapted The Lord of the Rings for the cinematic screen, he made a structural decision that made perfect sense for a Hollywood blockbuster. After the ring is destroyed, the heroes return to Minas Tirith. They are crowned, the crowds bow to them, and then they return to the Shire, which is exactly as green and peaceful as they left it. The narrative ends with a cathartic, emotional release. But John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was a veteran. He knew that the cinematic ending was a lie. In the original text, there is an entire, deeply depressing sequence of chapters that occur after the ring is destroyed. When the four hobbits finally ride back to the borders of their beloved Shire, they do not find a sanctuary. They find an industrialized nightmare. We have arrived at the scoring of the Shire. As Frodo, Sam, Merry and Pippin ride through their homeland, they are met with a landscape of ruin. The beautiful ancient trees of the Shire has been needlessly chopped down and left to rot. The clean rivers have been polluted with toxin runoff. The old, warm hobbit halls have been dug up and replaced with ugly, cheap brick buildings with smoke-belching chimneys. The Shire has been taken over by a gang of human ruffians, led by a spiteful, broken wizard named Sharky, who is revealed to be Saruman. Stripped of his great power, Saruman has resorted to petty, vindictive vandalism. He could not conquer the world, so he decided to ruin the Hobbit's garden out of pure spite. For the veterans of the First World War, this chapter is not a fantasy. It is a documentary. When Tolkien and his fellow soldiers finally returned to England, they found that the Edwardian summer was dead. The quiet, rural landscapes of their youth were rapidly being devoured by the urban sprawl, mass industrialization, and the relentless march of the modern machine age. The very homes they had bled in the mud to protect had been paved over. The war had not just killed their friends, it had destroyed their past. The hobbits are forced to fight one last ugly little battle to reclaim their home. They drive Saruman and his ruffians out. They begin the long, slow process of cleaning up the ash, rebuilding the mills and planting new trees. Samwise Gamgee leads this restoration. He represents the resilience of the working class soldier. The man who returns from the nightmare rolls up his sleeve and physically forces life back into the dead earth. But, as we discussed in our previous chapter, Frodo cannot participate in this healing. The trauma of the ring, the memory of the Dead Marshes, and the shadow of the eye have permanently altered his spiritual DNA. He looks at the rebuilt Shire and he realizes that there is no place for him in it. And so, we must take the final journey to the western shores. We must travel to the Grey Havens. On the docks of the Grey Havens, a white ship is waiting. It is here that the ring-bearers, Bilbo, Frodo, Gandalf, Elrond and Galadriel, prepare to leave Middle-earth forever. They are the artifacts of a passing age. They carry too much history, too much magic, and far too much pain to remain in the mundane world of the new era. This departure is Tolkien's ultimate, heartbreaking metaphor for the passing of the veteran generation. It is the grim acknowledgement that, for some soldiers, The wounds are simply too deep to be healed by the passage of time or the comforts of home. True peace, true rest, can only be found outside the circles of the world. Frodo embraces Sam one last time. He hands him the Red Book of Westmarch, the history of their suffering, passing the memory of the Great War to the generation that will live in peace. He steps onto the ship. The sails catch a wind that does not blow on mortal shores, and the vessel slips quietly into the grey mist, carrying the ghost of the Somme away from the world of men. The Third Age ends, the magic fades, and Samwise Gamgee walks slowly back to a quiet house, a warm fire, and a world that has finally stopped screaming. We have finished mapping the trauma. We have seen how the mud, the wire, and the artillery of the Great War forged the absolute darkness of Mordor. We have witnessed the breaking of the hero. But Arda is not merely a landscape of mud and iron. It is a universe authored by a divine song. It is a realm held together by invisible laws, ancient oaths, and profound, ethereal energy that we crudely call magic. Why does the magic of Middle-earth feel so incredibly real, so ancient, and so terrifyingly heavy, when the magic of modern fantasy feels like a cheap parlor trick? Why does Gandalf fight with a sword instead of a fireball? What is the actual physical weight of a spoken word in the dark? When we return to the study for our final expedition into Tolkien's mind, we will leave the battlefields behind. We will look beyond the physical world, and we will decode the hidden spiritual mechanics of the universe itself. Join me next time for the magic of the unseen. Until then, close your ledgers. The war is over. The night is quiet, and the rain is still falling.